To get an insight into a culture, it's not all about uncovering objective meaning. It's also about getting inside value systems and understanding the webs of association through which these values flow. Such a web can be identified which incorporates Stonehenge and the roundhouses in which people lived at the time Stonehenge was constructed, and also the pottery designs that were prevalent at this time. And it gives us a real key into the mindset of the period. The pottery style of the time is known as grooved ware. Unlike other styles, this was not imported from the continent, but was developed within Britain. It seems to have started in northern Scotland and found its way down into the rest of Britain from there. We can see some examples here. Note the characteristic cross-hatching, and also in the example on the left, the characteristic vertical ridges running around the pot. It's previously been suggested, and as far as I'm concerned there's no reason to doubt the suggestion, that this pottery style echoes the forms of woven baskets, and in the two examples here, the one on the left would appear to be reflective of a wickerwork piece, while the one on the right may be reflective of a woven grass or reed basket of some sort. It's reasonable to conclude that they chose to echo these forms in clay pots because they were holders of value. This probably came from a number of directions. For example, to take natural materials and then use skill and attention to produce from them an artifact that is neat and pleasing, ordered, balanced and harmonious in its design is fundamentally and universally satisfying, leading to a sense of achievement. Working with the hands can also cause humans to feel content and at peace. Such forms therefore probably represented civilization and cultural development to these people. Added to this, they probably also valued these skills because of what they allowed them to do. In addition to providing storage and vessels for carrying, the same wickerwork techniques were used to produce larger hurdles that could be daubed with cob and used to form the walls of roundhouses, keeping out the elements and allowing them to stay sheltered, warm and dry, relatively speaking. But forming clay versions of baskets likely had another level of significance. Grooved ware pottery is commonly found in association with henge sites and burials. These are baskets for eternity. While reed and wicker baskets are organic and subject to decay over a relatively short period of time, fired clay vessels can last for millennia. A suitable object to place in the grave for the afterlife, in other words. We see the same thing in architecture in various cultures. When the ancient Egyptians first started building in stone, they reproduced the forms of reed structures. And in the classical architecture of Greece, we can see, for example, that the small cubes that run along the eaves of the temples are really reflective of the ends of wooden rods that formed part of the structure of the roofs of wooden buildings. Value flows through these webs of association in both directions. A stone temple that reflects the traditional forms of wooden houses becomes a version of a house that has been elevated to the zone of the afterlife and the gods. It becomes a physical representation of an idealized idea of the archetypal house, a representation of the Platonic form, you might say. Once you have such a structure on prominent display, every wooden house becomes a kind of copy of that central temple, while the temple is itself a kind of copy of the ideal form. And so you have a chain of connection whereby the ideal flows down through the web of associations into the everyday world. Exactly the same is true of Stonehenge. The first stage of building a Neolithic or Bronze Age roundhouse was to construct a circle of upright timbers, which were then joined and steadied using wooden lintels going in a circle around the top of the ring. It is this that is reflected in the outer ring of sarcens with lintels at Stonehenge. We can't know for sure, but it's entirely possible that, as has been previously suggested, Stonehenge was not actually a stone circle like, say, Avebury or Stanton Drew, but that what we see now is really the skeleton of a grand roundhouse built in stone for the gods or the dead or royalty or some combination. They were unable to build the roof in stone, but it may well have existed, formed from organic materials such as wood and thatch. Even if they didn't get as far as roofing the structure, the resonance with roundhouse design is undeniable. The next observation is, I think, a fascinating thought. Roundhouses with conical roofs have a significant amount of runoff when it rains hard, and without gutters to direct that somewhere, it collects on the ground just outside the walls. This will then tend to seep up through the walls, especially when they're built of organic materials and cob, leading to cold, damp walls that will be more liable to degradation. The ancient roundhouses tended to have a ditch around them, presumably for this practical reason, to drain the water away from the immediate vicinity of the walls. But with this becoming the traditional form, it may well have taken on symbolic and magical meaning, such as being seen as a boundary that spirits will not cross, and so on. Stonehenge, of course, also has a circular ditch around it. And this is what leads us to a fascinating conjecture. At Stonehenge, it's set back away from the stone structure, but it's very tempting to think that it may have been a symbolic drip gully, just as with the ones around the roundhouses. This would fit with the stone structure itself representing a roundhouse for eternity, a place for the gods or ancestors, or both, just as Egyptian and Greek temples were seen as a house for a particular god. If so, then perhaps this symbolism extends to other sites where we find henges. Perhaps Avebury, with its massive outer ditch, had similar symbolism, with the ditch representing the drip gully and the stones symbolising pillars, even though they surely never supported a real structure. But there's a further link here, of course, right back to the baskets, because in the roundhouse, the gaps between the uprights were filled with wickerwork hurdles daubed with cob. Since the roundhouse therefore consisted of a series of verticals in a circle with wickerwork in between them, the design was essentially the same as that of a wickerwork basket, as reflected in grooved Ware pottery with its vertical ridges and hatching designs between them. So the web of associations extends right from the great temple out to the small earthenware pots, and from there to the wicker and reed baskets themselves, all connected by a common design structure and thematic motif. All this gives us a great entry point into their culture. We don't need to understand the objective meanings of their symbols in order to be able to get a sense of this web of associations and to get a feel for the values that flowed through this web.